Merry Christmas.
Executor, Darth Vader's colossal flagship, drifted silently through the cold expanse of space. Inside, the dark corridors buzzed with the disciplined hum of Imperial activity. Officers hurried to their posts. Stormtroopers stood at rigid attention, and the low rhythmic breathing of the Dark Lord himself echoed ominously through the command deck. Vader stood before the massive viewport, his silhouette framed against the shimmering stars. He stared out into the void, his gloved hands clasped tightly behind his back. Despite the vastness of the galaxy at his command, something gnawed at him, a distant, irksome sound that he couldn't quite silence. "Commander Piet," Vader said, his voice a deep rumble. Admiral Piet, who had been studying a tactical readout nearby, stiffened and hurried to Vader's side. "Yes, my lord?" Vader didn't turn. "I've received reports. Tell me, what is this Life Day nonsense I keep hearing about?" Piet swallowed nervously, carefully choosing his words. "Life Day, my lord, is a holiday celebrated in many parts of the galaxy. A time for unity, gratitude, and joy." "Joy?" Vader's voice dropped, sending a chill through the room. "Yes, my lord," Piet said, his voice barely above a whisper. Vader turned, his imposing helmet casting a shadow across Piet's pale face. "And what, Admiral, does the Empire have to do with joy?" Piet shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing, my lord. It is not an Imperial holiday." "Good," Vader said, stepping closer. "Then explain why I am seeing reports of Life Day celebrations spreading even to Imperial territories. Decorations on Corellia, singing on Coruscant, and Kashyyyk." His voice trailed off, the name of the Wookiee homeworld dripping with disdain. Piet hesitated. "The Wookiees, my lord, are particularly fond of Life Day traditions. They consider it a deeply sacred..." "Enough." Vader raised a gloved hand, silencing the Admiral. "A sacred holiday? Pathetic. Life Day is a distraction, a weakness." Piet bowed his head, unsure how to respond. Vader turned back to the viewport, his cape swirling behind him. "Prepare the fleet. We will crush this foolishness before it spreads further." In the war room, Vader loomed over a holographic map of the galaxy, his fingers drumming against the console. Imperial officers watched nervously as he paced, their fear palpable. "Our first target," Vader declared, pointing to a glowing system on the map, "will be Kashyyyk. The Wookiees are the heart of this insipid celebration. If we destroy their Life Day, the rest of the galaxy will fall in line." One officer, bolder than the others, stepped forward. "My lord, wouldn't it be more efficient to..." Vader's hand shot out, and the officer clutched at his throat, gasping for air. "Efficient?" Vader hissed. "What would be efficient is ending this conversation." The officer crumpled to the floor, and the room fell silent. "Any other suggestions?" Vader asked, his tone icy. No one dared to speak. "Good," Vader said, his voice calm once more. "Launch the TIE squadrons. Deploy stormtroopers to every major city on Kashyyyk. I want this Life Day eradicated." Later, in his private chamber, Vader sat alone, the glow of his meditation pod casting eerie shadows on the walls. He stared at the faint blue projection of a Life Day parade from Coruscant, a street filled with laughter, music, and twinkling lights. It sickened him. "What is the point of this frivolity?" he muttered, his voice reverberating within the pod. "Lights and songs cannot change the galaxy. It is power, fear, and control that rule all." the image shifted to a family of Wookiees gathered around a glowing orb, their deep, resonant voices singing an ancient Life Day hymn. For a moment, Vader hesitated. Something stirred in the recesses of his mind, a faint memory of another time, another life, a child's laughter, a woman's voice, warmth. Vader shook his head violently, banishing the thoughts. "Sentiment is weakness," he growled. He pressed a button, extinguishing the projection. Rising from his meditation pod, he donned his helmet and strode toward the bridge. "If they wish to cling to their joy," he said softly, "then I will take it from them." The bridge of the Executor hummed with tense energy as the fleet approached Kashyyyk. From the viewport, the forested planet glimmered with reflected light, its surface dotted with Wookiee tree cities. Vader stood at the helm, his hands clasped behind his back as an officer approached cautiously. "My lord," the officer said, bowing, "we've received an incoming transmission from Kashyyyk. The Wookiees wish to address you directly." Vader turned slowly, the mechanical hiss of his breathing filling the silence. "How quaint," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Patch it through." The officer hesitated. "My lord, they..." "Do it." The holographic projector flickered to life, revealing the towering figure of a Wookiee elder. His fur was streaked with silver, and his golden sash glittered with ceremonial markings. He stood in a vast hall filled with other Wookiees, all watching with somber expressions. The elder leaned forward, his deep guttural growl resonating through the bridge. Vader tilted his head slightly. "Translate." An officer nearby began interpreting. He says, "Great Lord Vader, we humbly request that you spare our Life Day traditions. It is a sacred time for our people, a celebration of unity and hope." Vader's shoulders tensed. "Hope," he repeated, his voice icy. The elder continued, his growls and roars accompanied by sweeping gestures. He says, the officer translated, "Life Day is not an act of rebellion, but an expression of our shared spirit. It is a time when even the darkest corners of the galaxy can find light." The elder placed a massive paw over his chest, bowing his head. His voice softened, but its sincerity was clear even before the translation. He says, "We ask not for ourselves, but for our children. Let them see that even in war, peace can endure." The bridge fell silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed subdued as the Wookiee elder's words hung in the air. Vader's mask betrayed no emotion, but his mind churned. For a fleeting moment, the elder's plea reminded him of another voice, gentle, unwavering, filled with compassion. A voice he hadn't heard in decades. His fists clenched at the memory, and the faint stirrings of unease were smothered beneath the crushing weight of his anger. Vader stepped forward, his imposing figure towering over the hologram. "You dare to appeal to me with such sentiment?" he said, his voice laced with venom. The elder straightened, growling defiantly. He says, "If you take away our hope, what will you leave us with?" The officer translated. "Fear," Vader replied coldly. "Fear is what binds the galaxy. Fear is what ensures order." The elder roared, his voice filled with sorrow and defiance. The officer hesitated before translating. He says, "Then you have lost more than we ever will." Vader's hand twitched, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. With a flick of his fingers, he ended the transmission. "Prepare the troops," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. "We begin the assault immediately." As the officers hurried to obey, Vader remained by the viewport, staring at Kashyyyk. His mind was not on strategy, but on the words of the Wookiee elder. "Hope," he muttered to himself. light in the darkness. He remembered the warm laughter of Padme, the innocence of young Luke and Leia, memories he had buried deep beneath layers of anger and despair. Vader shook his head. Weakness, he growled, as if trying to convince himself. But for the first time in years, a crack had appeared in the armor of his heart, and something unfamiliar seeped through. The towering trees of Kashyyyk shuddered as Imperial TIE fighters roared overhead, their menacing shadows streaking across the forest floor. Columns of stormtroopers marched through the Wookiee villages, their blasters trained on the subdued inhabitants. Lights and decorations, intricate orbs, glowing ribbons, and sparkling garlands were ripped from tree homes and tossed into smoldering piles. Vader arrived amidst the chaos, stepping off his shuttle with his black cape billowing behind him. The villagers turned their eyes away, their growls and cries muted by fear. Efficient, Vader observed, his voice cutting through the hum of activity. Destroy it all. Leave nothing to fuel their defiance. Yes, my lord, barked an officer, saluting before barking orders to the stormtroopers. As Vader strode through the village, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground, something caught his attention. A faint, melodic hum. It was out of place amidst the shouts and blaster fire, and it made him pause. Turning a corner, he saw a small figure sitting alone near the edge of the clearing. A human child no older than 10 was perched on a fallen log. She was humming a soft tune while carefully threading tiny glowing crystals into a string of Life Day garlands. Her small hands worked quickly, her focus undisturbed by the commotion around her. A stormtrooper approached, his blaster raised. "Move along, kid," he barked. "No more of that." The child looked up, her large brown eyes calm and unafraid. "Why? It's just for Life Day." The stormtrooper hesitated, his voice faltering. "Orders are orders. Get out of here." The child didn't move. Instead, she looked past the trooper to Vader, who had silently approached. Her eyes narrowed with curiosity, not fear, as she tilted her head. "You're the one giving the orders, aren't you?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. The stormtrooper froze, casting a nervous glance at Vader. For a moment, the Dark Lord said nothing, his towering presence casting a long shadow over the child. "I am," he finally said, his deep voice a quiet rumble. The child stood, brushing snow from her simple tunic. She held up the garland she'd been working on, the glowing crystals catching the light. "Why are you doing this? It's just a celebration. It's not hurting anyone." Vader tilted his helmet, his mechanical breathing the only sound in the now silent clearing. "Life Day is a distraction," he said. "It breeds weakness." The child frowned, her small face scrunching in confusion. "But Life Day is about hope," she said. "It's about remembering that even when things are hard, people can still find a way to be kind to each other." Vader's hand twitched at his side. "Hope is a lie," he said coldly. The child didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step closer, holding the garland out toward him. "My mom used to say hope is what makes us strong," she said, "even when things seem impossible." Vader stared at the garland, his mind suddenly awash with memories he had long suppressed. Padme's soft voice, speaking of hope for their unborn children. Luke's defiant declaration on the Death Star. The stormtrooper stepped forward. "Lord Vader, shall I—" "Leave us," Vader commanded, his voice sharp. The trooper obeyed immediately, retreating into the shadows. Vader turned his attention back to the child. "Do you not fear me?" The girl shrugged. "Should I?" Vader was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "What is your name?" "Raina," she answered, her voice steady. He looked at the glowing garland in her hands. And what do you think you are accomplishing by this defiance? It's not defiance, Raina said. It's a reminder. Even when everything seems dark, there's still light if you know where to look. Vader's hand clenched into a fist, though not from anger. The child's words struck something deep within him, something he thought had been extinguished long ago. "Return to your family," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. Raina hesitated, then nodded. She handed him the garland before stepping back. "Merry Life Day," she said softly, before disappearing into the trees. Vader stood alone in the clearing, the glowing garland draped over his gloved hand. For a long time he stared at it, the crystals pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The sounds of the raid faded into the background, as a single thought began to echo in his mind. Perhaps there is more to this than I understood. The executor hung in low orbit above Kashyyyk, its shadow casting a vast eclipse over the forests below. Within Vader's meditation chamber, the Sith Lord sat motionless, his breathing steady, but his mind far from calm. The glowing garland Raina had given him lay on the console before him, its soft light casting faint patterns across the dark walls. Vader's gaze lingered on it as flashes of memory swirled in his thoughts. Padme's laughter, Luke's determined eyes, and now the innocent defiance of a child offering hope in the face of fear. "Hope," Vader muttered, his mechanical voice filled with disdain. A hollow word, and yet the image of Raina's steady gaze refused to leave his mind. How could a child, weak and vulnerable, face him without trembling? How could she speak of hope as though it were a weapon stronger than the dark side? His fist clenched, and the lights in the chamber dimmed as if responding to his turmoil. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life. "Lord Vader," Admiral Piet's voice came through cautiously. "The village raid is complete. The Wookiees have been subdued, and all Life Day decorations have been seized or destroyed." Vader's breathing quickened. "Subdued," he repeated, his tone icy. "Have they surrendered?" There was a pause. "Not entirely, my lord. They have gathered in the central square singing their Life Day hymns. Despite our efforts, they refuse to cease." Vader's silence was heavy, and Piet rushed to explain further. "We can deploy additional troops to break up the gathering." "No," Vader interrupted. Piet hesitated. "My lord?" Vader stood, his cape sweeping behind him as he turned toward the exit. "I will handle this myself." The village square was alive with light and song. Despite the destruction wrought by the Empire, the Wookiees had rekindled their Life Day celebration. Glowing orbs hung from hastily repaired branches, and the deep resonant harmony of their hymns rose into the night sky. Stormtroopers stood at the edges of the square, their blasters drawn but unused. Even they seemed reluctant to disrupt the scene. As Vader entered the square, his black-clad figure a stark contrast to the warm glow of the decorations, the singing faltered. The Wookiees turned to face him, their eyes wary but defiant. Vader's gaze swept over the scene, the flickering lights, the solemn faces, the courage etched into every expression. He felt the weight of his own presence, the fear he carried like a weapon, but for the first time he wondered what it was truly worth. From the corner of his eye he spotted Raina standing with a group of rebels. She held another garland in her hands, her face lit with quiet determination. When she saw him, she didn't flinch or look away. Instead, she stepped forward, her small figure dwarfed by the towering Wookiees around her. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice carrying over the silent crowd. Vader stared at her, his breathing steady but slow. "To end this foolishness." "Then why haven't you?" Raina asked. The question struck him like a blow. Why hadn't he? He had every power at his disposal. The Force, his fleet, his stormtroopers. He could crush this gathering with a single command, but he hadn't. Instead, he had come here drawn by something he didn't fully understand. The singing, the lights, the courage. It stirred something within him that the dark side could not quench. "They defy the Empire," Vader said finally, his voice quieter than usual. Raina shook her head. "They're not defying you. They're celebrating. You don't have to destroy everything you don't understand." Vader's hand twitched at his side, his fingers brushing against his lightsaber. "You speak of things you cannot comprehend, child." "Maybe," Raina said, "but I think you do understand. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here." The Wookiees began to sing again, their deep voices weaving a melody that filled the square with warmth. The light of their life day orbs glowed brighter, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts around Vader. He closed his eyes, memories rushing in like a flood, Padme's gentle voice echoing in his mind. "There is good in you, I know it." For the first time in years, his resolve cracked. As the song ended, Vader turned without a word and walked back toward the edge of the square. The stormtroopers looked to him, awaiting orders. "Stand down," he said. The troopers hesitated but obeyed, lowering their weapons. Raina watched him go, her expression unreadable. As Vader disappeared into the shadows, she whispered softly, "Merry Life Day, Darth Vader." The executor floated in silence above Kashyyyk, as the first rays of dawn pierced the forest canopy below. On the bridge, the crew exchanged uneasy glances. They had witnessed Vader's silent retreat from the village, his cape flowing behind him, as he left the Life Day celebration untouched. Now, he stood before the viewport, gazing down at the planet. His gloved hand rested lightly on the garland Raina had given him, the glowing crystals pulsing softly in the dim light. "Admiral Piet," Vader said suddenly, breaking the silence. Piet stepped forward, his face tight with apprehension. "Yes, my lord." "Prepare the shuttles," Vader said, his voice calm but resolute. "We are returning everything we seized from the Wookiees' celebration." The crew froze, their expressions a mixture of shock and confusion. "Lord Vader," Piet asked hesitantly, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Vader turned, his imposing figure casting long shadows across the bridge. "Do not make me repeat myself, Admiral." "Yes, my lord," Piet barked, quickly moving to relay the order. The Wookiee village awoke to the hum of Imperial shuttles descending from the sky. Rebels and Wookiees alike tensed, bracing for another wave of destruction. But instead of stormtroopers with blasters, the shuttles carried crates filled with decorations, food, and gifts, everything the Empire had taken. The crowd parted as Vader himself stepped onto the snowy ground, his black cape trailing behind him. The stormtroopers at his side carried the Life Day orbs, garlands, and glowing ribbons, carefully placing them back where they had been torn down. The Wookiees exchanged astonished growls, their eyes wide with disbelief. Even the rebels seemed unsure how to react. "What's he doing?" one of them whispered. Raina stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Vader. "He's fixing it," she said softly. Vader approached the center of the square, where the largest Life Day orb had once hung. The Wookiees had tried to replace it with a smaller, dimmer one, but it didn't have the same brilliance. Without a word, Vader reached into the crate beside him and pulled out the original orb. He turned it over in his gloved hands, studying its intricate carvings. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he carefully lifted the orb and hung it in its rightful place. The moment it clicked into position, its light burst forth, brighter and warmer than ever. The Wookiees let out a collective cheer, their deep voices echoing through the forest. Raina approached him slowly, her small hands clutching another garland. She stopped a few steps away, looking up at the towering figure before her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Vader stared at her for a long moment, the light from the orb reflecting in his helmet. "Because I was wrong." Raina's eyes widened. She hadn't expected that answer, least of all from him. "Hope is not a weakness," Vader continued, his voice softer than usual. "Perhaps it is what binds the galaxy together." He took the garland from her and draped it over a nearby branch, its glowing crystals adding to the festive atmosphere. "Thank you," Raina said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. Vader didn't respond, but a faint nod of his helmet conveyed more than words ever could. As the day wore on, the Wookiees and rebels resumed their celebration, their songs rising once again into the sky. The stormtroopers, unsure of what else to do, awkwardly joined in, some even helping hang decorations under the watchful eye of their commander. Vader stood at the edge of the square watching the scene unfold. For the first time in years, the darkness within him felt lighter, as though the weight of his choices had begun to lift. "You'll need to leave soon," Raina said, stepping up beside him. Vader turned his head slightly, acknowledging her presence. "If the Emperor finds out what you've done," she hesitated, then added, "he won't be happy." Vader's breathing filled the silence before he replied, "Let him find out." Raina smiled. "Merry Life Day, Darth Vader." For a moment, the Sith Lord said nothing. Then, quietly, he responded, "Merry Life Day, Raina." As the Executor rose back into orbit, the Wookiee village below shone like a beacon of light against the snowy forest. Life Day had been saved, not by the rebels or the Wookiees, but by the Dark Lord of the Sith himself. Perhaps the galaxy wasn't so far from hope after all.